Caleb's, who is joining me now on set. He was in Iraq for a couple weeks, recently got back, and want you to weigh in on the president's speech as well.
Well, I think there was a lot said in that 15 minutes. Firstly, he did say that he needs, or he wants, the congressional support. He basically said, look, the United States is very strong individually, but if we stand together in a united fashion, that's going to be very good for us. One thing he has been talking to his diplomatic corps, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry about, who is in Iraq today. He looks back to the past. In 2003, George W. Bush had what he called the Coalition of the Willing when he launched an invasion of Iraq. Before that, Bush's father, George H.W. Bush, helped frame a massive coalition to help drive Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. Obama is trying to put together that same kind of coalition right now. That's another message that the president wants to get out to the world as well. There are 9 Western allies that have already signed on to this, but a big part of this is going to be to get the Sunni states, the Gulf states, those states that are neighboring Iraq, to sign on and actually pledge either money, troops, some way to stand up to ISIS. This is going to be very important. Tomorrow, we know the Secretary of State is going to be in Jordan meeting with King Hussein there, and then King Abdullah, rather. And then the day after that, we know he's going to be in Saudi Arabia, and he's going to meet with 6 Gulf states. New York Times is reporting already that Saudi Arabia has already agreed to allow training to fight ISIS to go on in that country. That's important because we had a map earlier about just the amount of land that ISIS now controls. ISIS, ISIL, Islamic State, whatever you want to call that terrorist organization. They control a large part of northwestern Syria. They control a large section of Iraq, moving through the north, down, circling Baghdad. So it's going to be very interesting. I think there's some questions that really jump out at you. Why did it take so long? I mean, this did not sneak up. This has been going on for some time. The president did talk about having the 150 airstrikes so far. Most of those have been near the Mosul Dam or the Haditha Dam in Iraq, trying to drive ISIS out of those areas, because if a terrorist organization has control of a dam, they could release horrific flooding. They can control water supplies. They can control electricity supplies. So there's a lot at stake. Why did it take so long? I'm going to be very interested to hear what Congress weighs in and says about this on both sides of the aisle, both Democrats and Republicans, to say, you know, we welcome you saying this, but it's about time.
Sean, let's bring in Austin Lawn for additional perspective. Now that we've heard this strategy, he's a professor at Columbia University where he teaches security policy. He has also served in Iraq as an analyst and advisor to the multinational force Iraq and the U.S. military. Austin, first I'd like to get your reaction to the president's address.
Well, I thought the strategy the president outlined was a good one. It makes a lot of sense, but as with all strategies, I think the devil's in the details. It'll be a very difficult strategy to execute in some ways.
Sean, I'd like to bring you in as well if you have any questions for Austin.
Austin, can you just expand on that? Because, you know, the one thing the president said is there have not been specific threats against the United States, but he used tremendous rhetoric to say the United States is not going to stand up to this kind of loose threats, and the fact that there are so many people with Western passports who are apparently training and fighting with ISIS. Tell me about your concerns about that, and when you talk about the specifics, what would you like to hear the president say?
Sure. I think in terms of the threat of Westerners that are fighting there, I tend to agree with the president that the specific threats look low right now. You can't discount them, but I do think that most of those Westerners are going there to fight in Iraq and Syria, and that's where most of their fighting is going to be done. There hasn't been any specific evidence that they're trying to come back here to fight. So I'm with the president on that. In terms of specifics, I think one of the big ones is what you mentioned. If you're trying to build such a big coalition, it can be very difficult to get all of those coalition partners to agree to the same strategy and stick to it. And I'll just highlight the fact that right now in a different country, in Libya, the United Arab Emirates and Qatar are essentially on different sides of a civil war. So, you know, getting just those two on the same page in Iraq and Syria may be difficult.
Austin, also I want to ask you about Iran. That country is specifically being left out of this coalition. And when we were in Iraq just a couple of weeks ago, the president of the autonomous Kurdish region thanked Iran for being the first country to send weapons there. What is this going to do to that area in the region? The kind of concerns that you may have.
Yeah, I think, you know, Iran has gained at least a little bit of political capital in parts of Iraq. Certainly not the Sunni areas, but The Kurds and certainly the Shiites are very thankful for Iranian support and helping to mobilize Shiite militias to provide military support and things like that. And the president mentioned the new government in Iraq, and it is a new prime minister and a reshuffling. But a lot of the actual cabinet ministers, the names are quite similar. So it'll be interesting to see whether this is truly a new and different Iraqi government or just sort of a new face on the same old, same old.
And Austin, he outlined a plan, but what about on the other side of this? What will it take? How long can this take?
It could take a very long time. I mean, I think the president was right not to attach any specific timeline other than to say it will take time, because you can just look back. I mean, he mentioned that the Islamic State comes from al-Qaeda in Iraq, and the United States, even with boots on the ground, even with massive amounts of air power, was not able to fully eradicate al-Qaeda in Iraq, only in Iraq. Now you're talking about a group that's expanded, beyond that. So I think the United States can achieve some pretty impressive results in terms of moving the Islamic State out of places like the Mosul Dam, but actually destroying the group may be a very challenging endeavor.
Austin, Syria, first, the fact that they're going to arm the opposition, that can be a double-edged sword in many different ways. And secondly, there are only about 30,000 ISIS soldiers, troops, whatever you want to call them. Explain how 30,000 people can be so disruptive to an entire region. And secondly, do you have any concerns about saying we are going to arm the opposition in Syria?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about arming the opposition in Syria now is it's already been pretty badly damaged by fighting with both the Assad regime and the Islamic State. So it's not clear how much is left of them. There was just an attack on one of the, I won't call them moderates, but one of the non-Islamic state groups yesterday that killed a lot of its leadership. And this is a standard tactic the Islamic State and before that al-Qaeda in Iraq have used. So I'm not sure these groups are even fully capable of making use of a bunch of aid. So the concern there is if you dump a bunch of weapons onto a group that's organizationally, or groups that are organizationally already kind of weak, you may just open yourself up for the Islamic State to crush them and seize those weapons, which we've already seen some evidence of. In terms of the Islamic State's capabilities, what they lack in raw numbers, and thousands of fighters is still a pretty significant number. They make up for in organizational capability and discipline. And the other piece of it is their enemies, they're fighting on multiple fronts, but their enemies aren't coordinated, right? The Free Syrian Army and the Assad regime are clearly not coordinated. Even coordination between the Iraqi government and the Kurds has been a bit touch and go at times given the political tension. So that helps them a lot, the fact that their enemies are not unified.
And Austin, one last question. The U.S. president made a point to say in this address that he said, this is not our fight alone. We can't replace Arab partners, putting it sort of back at the Iraqi government, making a point about this new coalition. What can you say about that?
I think the president is fundamentally right that the root of all of these problems are political, right? The political regime in Syria and the political regime in Iraq. It'll be interesting to see whether this new government actually does represent a fundamental change. And, the president mentioned retraining, rearming, re-equipping the Iraqi security forces and creating National Guard units in Sunni areas. We've seen this before in sort of 2006, 2007, and it worked as long as there was a significant U.S. presence there to provide both military support but also political support. It'll be interesting to see how well it works without a U.S. presence, very significant U.S. presence on the ground there.
All right, Austin Lawn, thanks for joining us from New York. Sean Caleb's here on the set. Again, this was the president's four-part strategy on Islamic State.